Curiously, classical prostheses have not received much in the way of attention from scholars, unlike those of later historical periods. And this is despite a growing interest in the subject of impairment and disability in classical antiquity. This has really been going on since about 1995. So we're looking at about 25 years of ancient disability studies. But in all that time, in all of that work, discussions of prostheses, prosthesis use, prosthesis users have so far played a relatively minor role. So the first monograph devoted to the subject of impairment and disability in classical antiquity, Robert Garland's The Eye of the Beholder. This is really what did in 1995 kick off the idea that we could study impairment and disability in antiquity. Although it is today rather out of date, because of course the field, someone's nodding very enthusiastically, yes, it is extremely out of date, because unlike perhaps some other areas of classics and ancient history, as far as disability is concerned, a lot has happened in 25 years. There's been a lot of progress in the real world and in the sort of the scholarly world as well. So Robert Garland then, he included a brief acknowledgement of the famous story of Hegesistratus of Elis and his wooden foot in a chapter focusing on medical diagnosis and treatment. But in doing so, he simply noted that it was possible for an ancient amputee to utilize a prosthesis. The second significant development, that one, Martha Lynn Rose's The Staff of Oedipus, transforming disability in ancient Greece. This is still a very good, very worthwhile piece of scholarship, although it is too dated, but in a different way to the first one. This was the first attempt to integrate the relatively new discipline of disability studies into classics, and she devoted slightly more space to the subject in the opening chapter of the work. An effort to sort of set the scene in advance of a series of studies focusing on particular aspects of impairment and disability in the ancient Greek world. However, she concluded that ancient prostheses would, in all likelihood, only have been cosmetic. And spoiler alert, she's incorrect, because I'm going to be talking to you for this hour or so about, this very subject. Then we get to, I'm standing right in front of me. Christian Lies, who is perhaps, I suppose, the highest profile figure working on disability in antiquity right now. He's published so many books and articles related to this that I'm not going to go through all of them. But he did publish, excuse my atrocious Dutch pronunciation, beperkt gehandicapten in het Romeins Rijk. Restricted, the handicapped in the Roman Empire, originally in Dutch. It contains an entire chapter on mobility impairments, but again, prostheses are mentioned only in passing. And the English translation, published, I think, by CUP, so published locally a few years later, it was roughly the same. It was slightly updated, but it was roughly the same text. And so if you look it up in the index, it's in the index, but it's not really dealt with in any sort of depth in the book. And otherwise, well, we get a lot of discussions of impairment and disability in the classical world in edited volumes, and you might there find, or expect to find, a bit more discussion in a sort of focused chapter or two. But actually, no, that still isn't the case. They generally haven't devoted more than one sentence or two to the subject. So in 1996, Lawrence Bliquez, any of you who work on ancient medicine will probably be familiar with him because he's done a lot of work on medical instruments. He published what was, even then, a rather cursory and incomplete survey in Ausstieg und Niedergang der römischen Welt. But despite the increasing interest in the history and archaeology of medicine in the classical world over the last two and a half decades, no more extensive study appeared. So enter me, I should say. From 2016 to 2019, I was Lord Kelvin Adam Smith Research Fellow in Ancient Science and Technology at the University of Glasgow. And the whole point of that position was to undertake some kind of postdoctoral project on some aspect of science and technology in antiquity. And so I chose, or I applied to do that on prostheses and prosthesis use and prosthesis users in classical antiquity, because it was something that I'd already been working on. It grew out of my work in anatomical votives, because I was interested in the representations of the body in material culture, and so I organised a workshop conference back in 2015, a long time ago now, and what came out of that was this edited volume, Prostheses in Antiquity. This was the workshop was funded by the Wellcome Trust in 2015. The edited volume came out in 2018, and this comprised 8 chapters, and each one dealt with a different type of prosthesis or an issue relevant to that subject. But of course, having done that, I did then realise that there was still so much more that could be said or needed to be said. So I did that over that period of postdoctoral fellowship, and then the years following. And my monograph, Prosthetics and Assistive Technology in Ancient Greece and Rome, was published by CUP in 2023. And my aim with that is, and to be honest, it's such a niche area that probably my hope has already been realised, that it will be the definitive treatment of prostheses and prosthesis use and prosthesis uses in the classical world, because frankly, who else is going to want to do it, you know? And when you see the handout, you'll understand why when you look at the tables on that handout. So in a nutshell then, you know, what I'm going to be talking to you about for the course of this lecture is this book, is the research behind this book. Because when it comes down to it, the literary, documentary, archaeological and bioarchaeological evidence that survives from classical antiquity attests that a variety of different types of prostheses were utilised by Greeks and Romans to replace various missing body parts, and literally everything you can think of. But the ways in which these prostheses were described and discussed by ancient authors likewise varied considerably, and as we shall see over the course of this lecture, some of them are viewed significantly more favourably than others by ancient commentators and potentially then ancient society as a whole. So in this presentation, I'll present some of my findings, of my research on this subject today, to I suppose a little bit beyond this, because I'm still sort of thinking about this. So I have possibly new thoughts that may arise spontaneously as I talk. And so I'm going to use some of the literary references to classical prostheses in conjunction with other types of evidence to examine the discourses surrounding them, in order to attempt to determine the place that each type had in ancient culture and society, and the ways in which the type of prosthesis utilised by an individual could consequently affect their life and their lived experience. So that is what you will need the handout for, is the literary passages that I'm going to look at. So first things first then, it makes sense to define exactly what I mean when I'm talking about the term prosthesis. And the term itself is a relatively modern one. Yes, you know, we're all sort of classicists, ancient historians in here. We recognise that it's a compound of the Greek. Well, okay, maybe not everybody. Most people I do. It's a compound of the Greek terms pros, on the side of, thesis, setting or placing. So you know, quite literally, or you're putting something on the side or on something or someone. But this isn't a term that is readily used by ancient authors. And in fact, it only enters the English language in 1533. So you know, considering where we are, not that long ago. It was initially used in a grammatical capacity to designate the addition of a syllable to the beginning of a word. And then in 1704, it begins to be used in a medical capacity to refer to some sort of artificial device that replaces or augments a missing or impaired part of the body. And it's only really in the middle of the 19th century that it comes to mean this almost exclusively. So of course, this is not ancient, none of this is ancient. So today then, in the 21st century, we're all familiar with the fact that a prosthesis is some sort of device that is used to replace a missing body part. And luckily, generally in the developed world, let us say, each one is designed and assembled according to an individual's appearance and functional need. So, you can see here, prosthesis, foot, the similarity between the two. And a standard prosthesis is usually, but crucially not always, as unobtrusive and as useful as possible, so as to maximize the chances of the user accepting it. And this missing body part might be missing due to a congenital impairment or an acquired impairment. However, it's by no means certain that an individual who's missing a body part, whether that body part is missing due to a congenital or an acquired impairment, will actually accept a prosthesis as a substitute for it. So as part of my research, I did go to the NHS and I did talk to prosthetists about this. And the insights that they were able to offer me were fantastic, because they were things that I would never have known on my own. I probably wouldn't even have thought about them as someone thinking about it in a historical capacity. But one of the things that I was told is that refusal of a prosthesis is particularly common in elderly amputees. And in the NHS today, most amputees are elderly people, just sort of for the various health conditions that they acquire as they age. As we shall see, this is quite different to antiquity. And studies have shown that if an individual both mentally and physically accepts their prosthesis and is satisfied with it, they will be more likely to use it. And it should not come as a surprise that users are more inclined to accept a prosthesis that is aesthetically pleasing to them. And one of the sort of horror stories that the NHS prosthetist that I talked to told me about was having to provide Black patients with white prostheses because they didn't have Black prostheses. And of course, you can appreciate how someone would feel under those circumstances and why they would potentially not want to use that prosthesis. So consequently, we find considerable effort being expended by the prosthetist to match an individual's skin tone, hair color, etc. Or if they're going in a different direction, to design and create something unusual and truly unique, if that's what the individual desires. And understandably, users are also more inclined to accept a prosthesis that makes their life easier rather than one that makes their life harder. So looking at all of this, then we can consider a contemporary prosthesis as having something of a dual role. One aspect of this is the form, what it looks like, and the other is its function, what it can do. Although, of course, form and function overlap. Part of what a prosthesis looks like is its function, really, and vice versa. And the nature of these forms and functions varies from prosthesis to prosthesis. An extremity prosthesis, such as a finger, a hand, an arm, that not only resembles the missing finger or hand or arm, but it can also restore some, probably not all, of the function. Whereas a facial prosthesis such as an eye or a nose, it resembles the missing eye or nose. It doesn't restore the lost sense of sight or smell, at least not yet. I mean, see, as we get further into the future and further into technological advancement, that could change, but right now it doesn't do that. But it does enable the user to pass if that is what they wish to do. And so these are all rather useful starting points for thinking about classical prostheses and the ways that people might have envisaged them when coming to use them. So when the word prosthesis is used in Greek literature, it tends to be used to sort of denote application. So you are applying an object to the body for a specific purpose. You are applying a medicinal remedy, such as a pessary, or a piece of medical equipment, such as a cupping vessel. But despite this, no surviving ancient Greek or Latin treatise mentions prostheses. Clearly, yeah, I'm being captioned, aren't I? But clearly, the application of a prosthesis to the body for the purpose of replacing a missing part, that's not considered a medical remedy. Better. And while this might seem strange to us, because of course we are in the 21st century accustomed to viewing prostheses and other types of assistive technology as objects that are thoroughly medicalized, this makes sense when we consider the way that the author of the Hippocratic Treatise on Joints feels that they have to explain and justify their decision to include recommendations regarding which type of crutch is best for rehabilitating different types of injuries that affect an individual's mobility. And so this, if you have a handout, this is number 1 on the handout. So this sort of explanation. One might say that such matters are outside the healing arts. You know, why bother? You know, it's incurable. But of course, this Hippocratic author says, you know, this is not the right attitude. You know, this is still part of medicine. They do seem to have been in the minority. So, of course, the loss of a body part is the very definition of an incurable case when it comes to some sort of medical problem. It was recognized as such, and this is perhaps why the provision of prostheses was not of interest to, or at least not considered relevant by medical writers. I mean, there are Aristotle differentiated between body parts that once lost would grow back. So, you know, obviously you cut your fingernails, you cut your hair, they grow back. But you know, in some cases, I suppose you knock out a tooth, a new tooth grows in its place if you're young enough. But you know, other parts they don't, despite what some stories about magical turtle blood in Antiquity tell us, that they don't grow back. And so Aristotle described individuals who experienced this latter type of loss as mutilated, so using the word kolobos for this. And whereas in the 21st century, we tend to refer to prostheses using the noun prosthesis or the adjective prosthetic, and in the NHS, at least one prosthetist will make any number of different types of prosthesis. In ancient literature, whatever the type of prosthesis under discussion, when prostheses are referred to, they are not described as, you know, prosthetic body part, prosthetic leg, arm, hand. They are described using the combination of the substitute body part and the substance from which it's made. So Pelops has a shoulder of ivory, Pythagoras has a thigh of gold, Hegesistratus has a foot of wood, Marcus Sergius Silas has a hand of iron, Statilius has the hair belonging to another. And this apparent lack of recognition of an overall category of object goes some way towards explaining what can appear to be a certain amount of cognitive dissonance on the part of ancient authors when it comes to their discourse, as we shall see shortly. So a little bit of a word about my research methodology of data. There isn't a uniform umbrella term, such as the adjectives prosthetic, as I've said, but we do find artificial or false being used by ancient authors to refer to ancient prostheses, but they don't do this all the time. You know, it's here and there. Perhaps the closest ancient authors come to that is referring to prosthetic hair and teeth using the adjective purchased. So purchased hair, purchased teeth. But again, they don't do that all the time. So As far as my research methodology was concerned, kind of didn't have one beyond reading. Searching for ancient literary references to prosthetics basically requires this extremely time-consuming process of entering numerous combinations of adjectives and nouns into bibliographic search engines, so TLG, TLL. And when that fails, which it frequently does, basically just reading ancient literary texts from all historical periods and all historical genres. So I have read some weird stuff, and a lot of the time it wasn't actually that useful. But you know, you never know. This is the moral of the story for students. Just literally read whatever, you know, take it off the shelf and just read it and have a look at it, because you never know. It might be weird and fun and cool. It may be none of those things, but you'll at least have read it, and then you can, you know, impress people with your esoteric knowledge at dinner parties. So going back to Lawrence Bleekers, in his initial study, Prosthetics in Classical Antiquity, Greek, Etruscan, and Roman prosthetics, he focused his attention rather selectively. And so he says, the scope of this investigation was confined to those devices attached to the human body which had some practical as well as cosmetic purpose. That is to say, I was interested in dental appliances and false limbs, as opposed to wigs and bodily padding of the sort detailed by comic poets and satirists. Very restrictive and not necessarily accurate, I would say, in response to that. But I've discussed my issues with Bleekers's differentiation between what he perceived to be as practical and impractical elsewhere. And in fact, I think if I can remember correctly, you can probably find that in there. But it's hard for me to think back to 2018 and what I was doing at that point. So using this rationale, he collated 15 ancient literary references to prostheses, and this comprised 11 dental prostheses, 4 extremity prostheses, 3 feet, 1 leg, 1 hand. Now, this is where I can just bask in the smugness of actually all that reading, because to date I've found 107. So rather more than 15. And again, little lesson for those of you who are students, just because a big important professor emeritus publishes something doesn't mean that you can't do it better. So you know, try. So these include references to prosthetic hands, shoulders, feet, thighs, eyes, noses, teeth, hair. If you've got the handout with the tables, I don't know if that's around. No? Okay. Well, the second part of the handout was tables. That would be table 1. Due to the nature of research, even this is not necessarily exhaustive. There's a lot more stuff that I probably could read, and I would find more if I had the time to do so, and perhaps if I ever do publish a second edition of that book, maybe I would do that. I don't know. But I have broken this down a whole lot more, again, tables. While these ancient literary references include both factual and fictitious prostheses, and even historical and mythological ones, that's table 2. To a degree, bioarchaeological and archaeological evidence supports their veracity. That's table 5. With examples of prosthetic toes, feet, legs, teeth, hair, and a hand having been recovered from tombs and graves around the ancient Mediterranean. And so this data set can be used to elucidate a substantial amount of information about prostheses in classical antiquity and the ways in which they were viewed in ancient culture and society. And this information includes the gender of the prosthesis user, table 3, and the material from which the prosthesis was made, table 4. And through using it, I propose to advance a theoretical taxonomy of ancient prostheses. So there will be those of you in the audience who are really glad that you don't have 5 tables to look at. And I hope there will be a few of you who are a bit sad about that. But Tim has the emails that I sent him with these. So when the photocopier is working, you can perhaps get them. Or just get my book from the library. They're all in there. So then, now we come to the discussion part, the part where the handout that you have will be useful. And so what I'm going to do then, rather than go through 107 different types of prostheses, because really, even in an hour and the lecture devoted to the subject, who's got time for that? I am going to talk about a selective, representative selection of 6 specific examples from works of ancient literature and demonstrate how they can be used to glean more information about prostheses in the classical world than the simple fact that they existed. And I've selected these examples, these specific examples, for several reasons. First, while they are a combination of factual and fictitious examples, they are, to all intents and purposes, historical rather than mythological examples. So, sorry guys, I'm not going to talk about Pelops. Read the book. I talk about Pelops in there. And the edited volume too, he gets talked about quite a bit. So 2 are factual and involve real historical figures. 4 may or may not be fictitious, yet are very specifically grounded in space and time. Second, they are relatively detailed regarding the prosthesis and the user and the use, which is not always the case, sadly. Third, they can give us insights into the lived experiences of the individuals in question, and by implication, other ancient prosthesis users too. And fourth, and I think this is probably the most sort of salient point, they contain enough information to enable us to start to consider ancient prostheses in relation to each other rather than in isolation. So on the handout there, and that should be 2, 3, and 4. They're big chunks of text. I'm not going to read them out. You can read. You probably have come across these before because they're in Herodotus and Pliny's natural history, and everyone's read those. And also Lucian, the ignorant book collector. Maybe not so many people read that, but in any case. These 3 different passages tell 3 different stories, and I'm going to talk about them. So Hegesistratus of Elis and Marcus Sergius Silas, so Herodotus's prosthesis user and Pliny's prosthesis user, were, as far as we can tell, real historical figures, while Lucian's rich man is likely a fictional character created by Lucian to make his point, although aspects of his portrayal may have been based on one or more real individuals that Lucian had encountered in the mid to late 2nd century CE. So the story of Hegesistratus comes from Herodotus' histories, can be dated quite precisely to 479 BCE, but it does seem to have been reasonably well known, as over 5 centuries later, Plutarch refers to it. I mean, I guess we know that Plutarch read Herodotus, didn't really like it, but I guess we could envisage that other people read it too, and so we're familiar with the story. Marcus Sergius Silas is only known from this entry in Book 7 of Pliny the Elder's Natural History, in which he's presented as an example to follow and a paragon of virtue. So presumably Pliny was not the only person that thought this, other people thought this too. Here we go. Its basic tenets are, however, supported by a reference to his quaestorship by Livy, which can be dated to 197 BCE, and a coin issued by one of his descendants, which you can see here, who bore the same name in either 116 or 115 BCE. And I'll step out of the way so you can see it. So we've got him here on a horse holding a sword and a severed head. But if you look closely, he is holding the sword and the severed head in his left hand rather than his right hand. So he lost his right hand in the Second Punic War, and he basically, because Romans held their swords in their right hands, they had the shields in their left arms, he basically swapped. And so he put his shield on his right, and not at the moment of his amputation, I should say, but later on. He had his shield on his right hand, his sword in his left, and so sword, severed head in the left hand, and that is what is being depicted on this coin here. And looking at these stories then, it would appear that both Hegesistratus and Marcus Sergius Silas conform to the modern supercrypt stereotype. And if you're not familiar with what that is, it's the stereotype of an impaired person who triumphs over the tragedy of their condition, who with astounding personal endeavor overcomes their disability, Dramatically, this image is useful to scriptwriters for whom a disabled person's triumph over their impairment is a metaphor for the more general human struggle to overcome life's obstacles. So it's a quote from Harnett. But basically, we see this in literally every fictitious portrayal of a person with a disability ever. And we also see it whenever the Paralympics are on. You know, everyone's got a sob story, and the Invictus Games as well. And so it's not enough for them to simply compete and be excellent and win. There's got to be that sort of personal journey triumph element to it. So it's rather distasteful to a lot of people who work on disability studies, and a lot of people with disabilities themselves as well, this idea that you have to be exceptional. And so Hegesistratus and Marcus Sergius Silas conform to this, you know, so it's although we have a new term for it, it's not actually a new concept. They triumph over several different types of adversity. First, you know, they actually lose their extremities. You know, Hegesistratus cuts off his own foot. Marcus Sergius Silas loses his hand. Second, they get imprisoned by their enemies. Third, in the case of Marcus Sergius Silas, his peers attempt to marginalize him and stop him from participating in society because of his impairment. And so both of them then can be said to be setting positive examples and be potential sources of information for amputees regarding the possibilities of prostheses. And additionally, for those aware of both of these individuals, Lucian's rich man, or any real individual that resembled him, would be compared to them and found wanting in the way that they use their prostheses, both their human prostheses, you know, their enslaved helpers, and their extremity prostheses. And obviously, we do get examples in ancient literature. Alexander the Great to Philip of Macedon, etc., and other people sort of attempting to give people with war wounds and disabilities pep talks about, you know, just remember, you know, you were injured during, you know, doing great things for Macedon, doing great things for Rome, you know, sort of like there kind of thing. But realistically, of course, that did not really help those people. Dio Chrysostom, writing in the late 1st century CE, makes the point that as if there were any use in a man having a golden or ivory hand or eyes of diamond or malachite, but the kind of soul he had, men did not notice. So perhaps we can take from this that there is a tendency for some individuals to use overly elaborate prostheses or make their usage performative, much to the chagrin of onlookers. And also notable here, and this is something that is always ignored in literally everything to do with ancient daily life, and it's the role that other people play in the daily life of an amputee. So the rich man requires the assistance of other people, his household enslaved people, to assist him in using his wooden feet to restore his physical mobility. Marcus Sergius Silas also utilized enslaved people. They would have assisted him in arming himself, helping him onto his horse, at the very least, if not more. Finally, although certain aspects of these ancient literary accounts might seem highly questionable, I mean, I suppose that there is the question of, do people really cut off their own feet to escape from prison? Well, any of you who have seen the James Franco film 127 Hours will know that, yes, so at least one real life person not too long ago did in fact cut off their own arm with their teeth and stone to escape from imprisonment. So yes, that is one aspect of the story that we might think is ridiculous, really happened. And although certain aspects of these ancient literary accounts might seem questionable, highly questionable, we do actually have archaeological and bioarchaeological evidence that supports all three. So as far as the use of wooden feet are concerned, we have a couple of examples from the archaeological record here. So we've got this is the end. So on the right here, we have a wooden prosthetic toe, the so-called Cairo toe from Egypt. It's been dated to either the 21st or 22nd dynasty, so circa about 1000 to 740 BCE. And we also have the Greville Chester toe, this one made of cartonnage from just before 600 BCE. So these toes roughly in use at the same time, but they both, interestingly, they're for exactly the same injury, the loss of the big toe on the right hand foot. And as far as the prosthetic hand is concerned, or the feasibility of using a prosthetic hand in a historical battle, we have a weaponized prosthetic hand with a knife attachment from Italy. And this has been dated to, let us say, late Antiquity, the 6th, the 8th century CE. But we have here an individual who lost their right hand quite a long time before they died. The injury itself was well healed. The knife prosthesis strapped on, their teeth actually showed wear from putting the hand on and off, the leather strap on and off. So clearly a long time had passed since the injury, and actually them using this weapon, and they did die in sort of late middle age as well. So sort of they had many years of this kind of weaponized hand life. Okay, so our next set of case studies, this will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 on the handout. So the next three. So we have some passages from Marshall and Myrinus and Petronius. And so these are all it's possible that Gallus and Statilius, the two people mentioned in the epigrams, were real historical figures whose likenesses were captured by Marshall and Myrinus during the late 1st century CE. Of course, Giton and Encolpius are both characters from Petronius's satirical novel Satyricon, which dates to the middle of the 1st century CE. But again, it's if they are fictitious people, then they are at least being based on real people who lived around that time. And in all three examples, we see individuals, both male and female, wearing wigs. And this seems to have been reflective of a reality in which both men and women wore wigs and hairpieces in ancient Roman society. Yeah. However, the differences in the ways that works of ancient literature describe men and women wearing wigs and hairpieces are clear. Most men are described as wearing wigs only in order to disguise themselves, usually before doing something nefarious. And only a few are described as wearing wigs to cover some kind of deficiency, such as premature or temporary hair loss. Whereas with women, the situation is reversed. And the criticisms that Marshall directs at Galla are typical. And there are traces of these in Myrinus's account of Statilius. He describes him as effeminate too. So for these two, prosthetic hair is inherently false. Its usage is designed to deceive. It's viewed as a type of luxury like silk or perfume, cosmetic. It's essentially a type of cosmetic. And we know that ancient men writing literature that we read hates that. In Petronius's Satyricon, we see prosthetic hair and eyebrows belonging to a woman repurposed by two men. And presumably this idea of two men wearing prosthetic hair in a feminine hairstyle was intended to be comedic, part of the joke being that the men themselves didn't understand this and were actually quite thrilled with their makeovers. Just as Lucian's rich man required the assistance of enslaved people to use his prosthetic feet effectively, so too did Giton and Encolpius require the assistance of an enslaved person to use their prosthetic hair and eyebrows effectively. And there are numerous ancient literary references to and artistic depictions of attendants dressing their mistress's hair. There is also archaeological and bioarchaeological evidence that supports all three literary accounts, as numerous examples of wigs and hairpieces have been recovered from tombs and graves dating to the Roman period from sites around the empire. You can see a couple of these here. Those of you who live near York, you can go and actually see this. Those of you who live near London, which I suppose It's all at the moment. It's not that far away. You can go and see this one in the Country Museum. So the kind of hair pieces and wigs that we see range from hair extensions in the form of braids that could be used to supplement existing hair and elaborate upon hairstyles to full wigs. So let's talk about gender. Why not? Both men and women are presented as having used prostheses in classical antiquity through ancient literature. However, there are significant differences, not only in the type of prosthesis that they are presented as using, but the ways in which these stories are told. Broadly speaking, there are way more examples of men using prostheses than women. Why? Is it simply the generally gendered nature of ancient literary prostheses? No, very possibly, because, you know, cherche les femmes, nowhere, really. It's notable that the references are found in both prose and poetry across a range of genres, but certain types of references are found in specific genres. The references to men using prostheses are found in all literary genres, while the references to women using prostheses, these tend to be concentrated in satirical poetry and prose, such as the works of Horace, Juvenal, Martial, Lucilius, Mardonius, Lucian. Men are generally presented as using extremity prostheses, feet, legs, hands, while women are presented as using facial prostheses, teeth, hair. Again, why? Is this indicative of a reality in which men were more likely to lose limbs, while women were more likely to lose facial features? This is, of course, completely possible because ancient literature attests that there was a considerable range of ways in which an individual could lose a body part. So someone might be born without a body part. This is called phocomelia, the absence of the proximal part of a limb, which causes the hands or feet to be directly attached to the torso, or meromelia, the congenital absence of specific parts of the limb, hemimelia, the partial absence of terminal parts of the limb, or amelia, the complete absence of the limb. Cassius Dio records that an embassy from India came to Rome to see the Emperor Augustus, and it brought with it the gift of a boy with no arms. However, this congenital absence of a body part is extremely rare. Relatively few examples survive in the skeletal record from any period of history, and I'm personally not aware of any from the period that I'm looking at. Much more common was an individual experiencing the loss of a body part during life. And this acquired loss of a body part could occur through very different circumstances. Traumatic amputation, i.e. it literally is ripped off somehow. Surgical amputation, better. Martial amputation, worse. Judicial amputation, extrajudicial amputation, self-mutilation or mutilation, so and the natural aging process. So none of these are pleasant, like, let us just say, but they obviously could be more unpleasant depending on the circumstances. And although realistically, it's likely that both genders could lose any number of body parts in any number of ways, it is antiquity, of course. It's horrible pretty much day in, day out for literally everybody. In literature, we do seem to see a focus on men losing their body parts through military or agricultural activity, and women losing their body parts through mutilation or aging. So, for men undertaking military activity, the loss of the right hand, as I've already talked about with Marcus Sergius Silas, the sword hand, and one or both eyes due to a lack of appropriate protective headgear and, you know, the use of projectiles in warfare. Seem to have been particularly common. We have Philip here. We're all familiar with Philip. While for men undertaking agricultural activity, the feet, the legs, these are at risk from accidents with agricultural tools or bites from venomous creatures. Women, on the other hand, seem to have been at risk from facial mutilation that occurred as the result of interpersonal violence that was carried out so as to purposefully spoil their beauty and so make them less attractive to men, therefore less valuable. So, you know, nothing has changed in sort of 2,000 years of misogyny. And why are you laughing? It's not funny. Yeah, I know. And the female natural aging process that resulted in the loss of teeth and the loss of hair, this receives much more commentary from ancient writers than the male aging process, because again, it comes back to the effect that this had on a woman's beauty, her attractiveness to men, her intrinsic value. Interestingly, in ancient Jewish literature, facial prostheses are recommended specifically to restore a woman's physical attractiveness and make her a more desirable potential bride. So we basically see rabbis being matchmakers and makeover people, and you know, advising women what to do if they happen to have lost an eye or a tooth, like that. But perhaps there was some sort of visible imbalance in ancient society, and this fed into existing stereotypes and bolstered them. And of course, we shouldn't necessarily forget that men were just a lot more visible than women. You know, if you're a respectable ancient woman, you are literally covered from head to toe in loads of cloth, so people can't see if you are missing a hand or a foot or something like that. Whereas, you know, with men, it's more visible. And the archaeological and bioarchaeological evidence supports these demarcations. Of the extremity prostheses that have survived from antiquity, all but one of those found in situ were found in the tombs and graves of men. So the capula limb, for example, from around about 300 BCE. I mean, it should add, this is not the original limb. This is a replica of the limb. The original limb was unfortunately destroyed in the Blitz, but you can still see this today. It used to be on display in the Science Museum. It's in storage now, I think, but you can request to see it as I did, and it's a very interesting object. And we have here the 6th century CE Hemmerberg limb. Just as we saw with the feet earlier on, here we have two roughly the same sorts of prostheses, and they're very, very different. So you can see this one found in situ in the grave of the man who wore it. And even more interestingly enough, the skeleton of this particular man is an older man, showed evidence of many years of horse riding. The loss of his foot and the part of his leg occurs exactly where, if you were riding a horse and your leg was sort of down the side of the horse, somebody with a sword, that's where they would get it. So he's such a horse rider that this in fact is how he lost his foot. Of the facial prostheses that have survived from antiquity, all of those were found in situ, were found in the tombs and graves of women. And the size of those that are on provenance indicates that they belonged to women too. So, as far as materials are concerned, the materials used to make prostheses vary considerably. We're talking gold, silver, iron, wood, ivory, bone, horn, diamond, malachite, leather, hair, and other types of textiles such as linen and plant fibers, all in a table. Thus, it's not surprising that the technical sophistication and complexity of prostheses should vary too. After all, a prosthesis composed of one material only required one type of artisan. Yet a prosthesis composed of 2 or more types of material, that requires multiple artisans all working in collaboration at all stages of the manufacturing process, so it's exponentially more complicated. I mean, you've all done group work, you know that works. Why are the literary references so variable? Is this indicative of reality? Were some prostheses simple, others complex? If so, why? Was it simply a matter of using whatever material you had to hand? Were some materials considered more suitable for certain types of prostheses than others? Were the wealthy elite more likely to invest in a technically sophisticated and complex prosthesis? Perhaps, but if so, why? Again, practicality, usability, not necessarily. So contemporary prostheses can be problematic for their users, and these, of course, are made with sort of cutting edge, modern medical scientific technology. So It's debatable how practical or usable any ancient prosthesis made without any of those things was. And we need then to consider what a prosthetic limb could offer its user that an alternative type of assistive technology, such as a staff or a walking stick or crutch, could not. So perhaps we should consider prostheses bodywear and include them in our discussions of dress and clothing, imagining wealthy and high status individuals using their prostheses to make specific statements about themselves, just as individuals in subsequent periods of history have done. So when it comes to things like these Etruscan dental appliances, broad gold bands worn across the teeth, plenty of people today wear grills and have, gold teeth or diamond studded teeth. I say plenty. Rich people with way too much money and not money paid to have those things. The rest of us just make do with our existing teeth. And the ancient Jewish religious teachings debate whether a prosthetic leg or foot should be considered a shoe or a tool. And individual rabbis have different opinions on this. If one's prosthetic leg or foot was classed as a shoe, it didn't affect their ability to access the temple or even leave their house on the Shabbat. But if one's prosthetic leg or foot was classed as a tool, then, well, basically you were subject to the same restrictions about using it as any other piece of equipment, i.e. you couldn't, no matter how crucial it was to your day-to-day life. And it would certainly appear that wigs, hair pieces, eyebrows, teeth were considered to be cosmetic, and as a result, part of the broader category of dress and clothing, and on occasion even costume. So we can look at some of the contemporary personalized prostheses that people have had made for themselves, and we can perhaps sort of start to understand some of what's going on here. So here we have people who were not interested in having prosthetics because heavy, uncomfortable, not practical. Whereas you could get a prosthetic to express something else about yourself. I wanted people to have to look at me twice with amazement. My alternative limb is so different to any other prosthetic limb I've ever seen. I wear it with pride. It makes me feel powerful, different, sexy. Once I had read a great line which stuck in my head on a website where a prosthetic user said, I want to take off my limb and leave it in a room and people will recognize it and know that it belongs to me. It reflects part of my personality. So we can see how more of these are really cool. So I'll sort of stand out of the way so you can kind of see them. We can see how, like expensive and beautiful jewelry, for example, a prosthesis might be used by its wearer as a means of communicating not just wealth, status, prestige, but also good taste and even fashion sense, tattoos, etc. It should be noted that a number of ancient literary references to prostheses state that, how am I for time, Liz?
5 minutes.
Oh God. Right, where are we? So it should be noted that a number of ancient literary references to prostheses state that the individual acquired their prosthesis themselves. So we can infer that some individuals made their own, and presumably they were absolutely reflective of that person's taste. But it's important to bear in mind that the process of designing, commissioning, manufacturing any object is frequently elided in ancient literature. And something that's apparent in the discussions of prosthetic teeth and hair that's not mentioned in discussions of the other types is the frequency with which they were purchased. And this implies that there was enough trade in prosthetic teeth and hair, at least, to allow makers to specialize, potentially even provide ready-made versions rather than made-to-measure ones. And again, archaeological and bioarchaeological evidence supports these demarcations. And judging from the other grave goods found in the inhumations, cremations, mummifications that contain prostheses, sophisticated prostheses have been found in the tombs and graves of high-status individuals, both male and female. Okay, but it needs to be borne in mind that the metal survives where organic materials such as wood and leather do not, and the prostheses of the poor were not necessarily any less technically sophisticated for all that they may have been made from less prestigious materials. And this is one that's from China and from a very, very poor community, and yet
here, this person who, they hadn't lost their leg, it was just frozen at the joint because of tuberculosis. So they created this for themselves to help them walk around, and it's made out of animal, it's got an animal hoof on the bottom. And so this, a lot of thought went into making something that would help this person walk around. So we have the most commonly cited material used is gold. There are several reasons why this might be. So gold, color, shine, it's instantly recognizable. It indicates wealth, status, prestige, luxury. So for members of the social elite, that's a suitable material. It marks you out from everybody else. So even people that are trying to be seen as elite, so Pythagoras, his imitator, Alexander the False Prophet, could use that as a way of differentiating themselves from other people. Practical reasons, if you're using it for the interior of the body, such as your mouth, your teeth, your gums, your eye socket, well, gold is not gonna hurt you. It's relatively harmless, unlike something like lead. If you're using, you know, lead fillings, not a good idea. Also a malleable metal, so it can be sort of shaped very easily. Yeah. We also have ivory, bone, and horn. These were likely used for similar reasons to gold. Obviously, we have the mythological antecedent in the tale of Pelops and his ivory shoulders. So we've got, again, this sort of prestigiousness, this relevance to the divine. It's associated with exotic creatures such as elephants. So itself is then exotic, luxurious. It's imported from territories like Africa and India. So it's a prestige material, and you know we can see that in its use in Proselephantine statues. And like gold, it's very suitable for things like false teeth. It, you know, it comes in the right sort of shapes, sizes, has the right sort of appearance, can be worked with relative ease. As for prosthetic hair, although not many of the ancient literary references specifically state that these items were made from human hair, we have other literary evidence for the hair trade and archaeological evidence in the form of wigs and hair pieces that indicates that this was in fact the case. The reasoning is probably due to the nature of the material itself. You know, human hair comes in a variety of colors and textures, so you can choose. Blonde hair was particularly popular in imperial Rome at certain points in time. And although wigs and hair pieces can be made from other types of textile, leather, plant fibers, and we do have some examples of those, they're basically one fixed style. They can't be manipulated the way that real hair can be. And it is surprising that so few ancient literary references are to prostheses made of wood, especially considering the archaeological evidence, not just from classical antiquity, but all historical periods up to the 20th century. That was the material most commonly used, especially for extremity prostheses. And the ancient references, all to legs and feet, do align with this. Probably wood is the most commonly used material for functional prostheses, for the same reason that it's used for other sorts of assistive technology, staffs and sticks and canes and crutches. And because it was so common, doesn't rate a mention, whereas gold or ivory do. Because with the exception of certain types of rare imported wood, ebony, citrus, etc., wood was not a prestigious material in the ancient Mediterranean. And in the only instance where the type of wood is specified, that wood is olive, and olive was readily available, and it was also a popular material for tools. It would have been a good choice because it's readily accessible in most cases, it's cheap, perhaps even free to acquire. You could go in the woods, pick some up. It's relatively easy to work, even for someone with rudimentary carpentry skills, and it's strong enough to bear the weight of the prosthesis user while being lighter and more maneuverable than metal. So I'm concluding now. It's clear then that classical prostheses were, if not rare, certainly not common. More significantly, it's clear that they were certainly not standardized in any way, even those that sought to replace the same parts of the body. Now, I've shown you a whole lot of examples of those. And this is to be expected in items that were in all likelihood designed, commissioned, manufactured entirely at an individual direction and discretion. But there does seem to have been some sort of consensus, at least in the literature that survives, regarding the relative merits of different types of prosthesis in ancient society and culture. And this literature allows a partial reconstruction of taxonomy, a tentative reconstruction of the lived experience of the classical prosthesis user. Extremity prostheses seem to have been viewed relatively positively, at least in situations where it's clear that they are being utilised as necessities rather than luxury. They were practical, useful, they empowered their users, they facilitated their return to some semblance of normality, and there are similarities with more recent wars, veterans of the Civil War in the US, the First and Second World War, and the restorative effects of these on the individuals themselves and their society more broadly are helpfully for us made much more explicit in advertising, the way that the prostheses were marketed and advertised. However, facial prostheses seem to have been viewed relatively negatively, while they may have been in reality just as practical, useful, empowering for their users as extremity prostheses were for theirs. They were dismissed by the individuals writing about them as ridiculous, vainglorious, fundamentally dishonest, and deceptive in a way that extremity prostheses were not. They seem to have been classed as a type of cosmetic rather than a type of assistive technology. Why the difference? Could it be the nature of the surviving evidence, coupled with the fact that the individuals recording these examples for posterity were working within pre-existing literary traditions and conventions? Maybe. However, we should also consider the nature of the prostheses themselves. No matter how technologically sophisticated they could be, an extremity prosthesis was unlikely to be mistaken for the limb that it sought to replace, whereas prosthetic teeth and hair feasibly could be. Or at least this seems to be the fear that is being expressed by ancient authors in their writings. And this leads us to wonder, or at least it leads me to wonder, what the purpose of a prosthesis in the classical world was, and how far it differed from the purpose or purposes of a prosthesis in the contemporary world. There's far more evidence of all kinds for individuals using other forms of assistive technology that would have been potentially much more effective than a prosthesis to compensate for some sort of physical deficiency. So prosthesis use was a deliberate and definitive choice, the motivations for which are up to us to continue to try and interpret. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jane. In a moment, I'm going to invite you, if you'd like, to join us in the Museum of Classical Archaeology for a glass of wine, and where you might be able to buttonhole Jane for a question. But she very kindly said that she would answer one of your questions now, if anyone has. Yes, definitely.
I think this is very interesting. I just wondered where you position your study in relation to disability studies. You seem a lot of your talks seem to be very medicalized. So I was wondering how you then view disability studies kind of contention that disability has been over medicalized or draws from the medical model, and how this relates to the social reality of disabled people.
I have talked about this in a chapter in a book called Iatromechanics. Is it called? No. I think it was originally meant to be called Iatromechanics. It might be now called Bodies and Machines. It came out just recently, I think late last year, also published by CUP, funnily enough. So you've probably got it in your library. And I did talk about this because the sort of from a historical perspective, broadly speaking, people don't really go in for the medical model. You know, it's anachronistic. We can't apply it to historical societies, ahistorical societies, and the social model, or at least variations on the social model, like the community model, the citizen model, is what people, scholars tend to think that, you know, your experience of disability varies according to what your position in life is, because there are different expectations attached to you. So a Roman senator, there are different things that are disabling to a Roman senator than there are to a farm labourer, for example. And so in that chapter, I talked about assistive technology from the perspective of there are cases in the ancient literature in which medical treatment is used to try and treat certain types of disability. So in some cases, I think the medical model, some very specific cases, I think we can apply the medical model to ancient evidence. But as I said in the talk, it doesn't seem like prosthetics are medical. You know, doctors don't prescribe them as far as we know, or at least not in the ancient literature that survives. It's not doctors that are making them, it's crafts people of all kinds that are potentially making them. I have a suspicion that they arose in a military context, because of the type of injuries that would lead to people wanting to use prostheses, and the blacksmiths and artisans that were associated with the production of weaponry and armor and things like that. It makes sense that they would be veterans would go to them perhaps for compensation regarding weapons and things. So what was the sort of fundamental of your question? Because I mean I think what I would say is I don't think prostheses are medical.
But you talk about your researchers within health and ancient medicine.
Yes, well, because that was where I came from as a researcher. I was interested, I was a medical historian first, and I became interested in prostheses as a sort of an offshoot of anatomical votives and surgery and things like that. But the more I researched them, and then I talk about this in the book, in the sort of the broader conclusion, and it's something I think it did come to me relatively late, actually, when I was concluding everything in the book, and it did occur to me that, well, yeah, let's think about them not as medical treatment, but as costume, clothing, ways of expressing something about yourself. And so, yes, I think, as I said at the very, very end, there are lots of other things that you could use, and crutches and things like that. So why would you use a prosthesis? And I do think that a lot of it is to do with what that can tell people about yourself. So I think we can perhaps think about them as clothing and jewelry and costume, and that is something that potentially need to do a little bit more of. So yes, I mean, if I sort of develop this further, I do want to sort of think about them in this sort of way.